So good night, everyone. Here I am, Rubens Novikineto from Curitiba, and I am with Mr. Larry Diamond. We are the study group Paideia of Philosophy of Law, located at the Federal University of Paraná, Curitiba, Brazil. Mr. Diamond, thank you very, very much for being with us here, one of the top experts and political scientists in the world. The pleasure is all mine.
The pleasure is mine. Obrigado.
It's quite an intriguing story. I've met Mr. Diamond 3 years ago when he was at here in Curitiba, when he came here to make the announcement of his book. In Portuguese, it will be To Understand Democracy, but the English title will be In Search of Democracy, a fantastic book, which I actually used last year doing a university project and exposition. Talk about a little bit about Mr. Diamond. He is senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and professor by courtesy of Political Science and Sociology at Standford University. So, Mr. Diamond, the first question I would like to pose to initiate our conversation. How would you define the rule of law and the state of exception? Those two concepts that were, especially in 2020, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen state of exceptions worldwide installing themselves, some in the name of combating the disease and other ones in the name of authoritarian measures. How would you define the state of law, the rule of law, and the state of exception?
Okay, well, a rule of law is a situation of governance in which everyone is equal before the law. The law is applied neutrally and enforced by an independent, non-political judiciary. No one is above the law, including those who hold executive power, and everybody has certain inalienable rights under a rule of law. I think we really cannot speak about an authoritarian rule of law, under an authoritarian regime or a populistic illiberal regime. It really kind of slides into rule by law. And my favorite phrase indicating what life is like under rule by law is what is at least attributed to your former populist authoritarian leader in Brazil, Getúlio Vargas, who is reputed to have said, "For my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law." And that is, I think I've heard that phrase before. That is not rule of law, that's rule by law, and that's manipulation of law in order to enforce favoritism and political hegemony. Rule of law is closely linked to a related concept of constitutionalism, that the Constitution is supreme and it reigns above any individual office holder. So there's a separation, as my late dissertation advisor and political science sociological mentor Seymour Martin Lipset argued, there has to be a separation between the source of authority and the agent of authority. And in a democracy, the source of authority is not Getúlio Vargas or Jair Bolsonaro or Donald Trump. The source of authority is the Constitution. And a president is only the agent of that. And the constitutional system has to provide for a constitutional court and a legislature and other agencies of horizontal accountability to check the arbitrary power of the executive and to have the Constitution and the law potentially reign supreme over arbitrary executive power. So I don't think there can be a rule of law absent minimal conditions of democracy and constitutionalism. Now we get to the however part, the exception part. Countries may face emergencies. There could be floods. There could be hurricanes, monsoons, or other earthquakes, natural disasters. There could be a terrorist incident, God forbid, war, and certainly, God forbid, but it's upon us, pandemic. And under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and more specifically, its operationalization in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which Brazil and the United States and almost every other state in the world are all parties to, exceptions are allowed in terms of guaranteeing the basic minimum of civil and political rights of assembly, of speech, of association, of press, and so on. Exceptions are allowed for concrete, demonstrable, life-threatening emergencies. Those are what states of exception are. But they have to be, any exception or departure from the rule of law in this sense has to be proportional to the scale of the crisis, has to be limited in time to the period of crisis, and has to be conferred transparently by the rule of law, some exceptional grant of power, either as a standing grant by the Congress or as something that is granted under the circumstances. But you can't just do what Hungary did and say, we'll let the president rule by decree indefinitely, or say, because now they've reined it in, but any decree he enacted can then just remain indefinitely unless the Congress reverses it. So exceptional states need to be exceptional in time, in scale, and in scope.
So from what I understood that you said, so the main difference of those populism and the rule of law will be that one would be the government of man, the cult of the personality, as for instance Vargas in Brazil, and the other would be the government of the laws, which everyone will be subject to the laws. And the primary notion of constitutional government that people know where the authority is, that will be in the constitution, not in the people or the people in government right now. So thinking to that, I would like
I can't improve on what you just said.
Well, it's quite interesting. I was reading yesterday, Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, and he literally said those same words in the book 5 when he's talking about justice. There's a problem of posing a government of men, because they can lead this into tyranny, as you said, in Hungary, or in Central America, there are some cases also. But the government of laws and the mobilization of the civil society will guarantee the protection of justice. My second question would be, can we speak of rule of law without democracy? Because, I personally understand that the rule of law was a concept developed before democracy. As we open our history books, we would say that the rule of law emerged with the Magna Carta in the 13th century, and from then it evolved. But nowadays, the 21st century, can there be a rule of law without democracy? And can a tyrant legitimate himself using the laws that already exist? Would the rule of law guarantee the tyrant himself the power, so he could afterwards dismantle the rule of law? Or the tyranny cannot emerge the rule of law, only another thing?
So I think I've spoken to this in one sense, in a theoretical or almost philosophical, definitional sense. by saying that I don't think you can have an authoritarian rule of law. I don't even think you can have, let's say, stipulate that you can have a semi-democratic regime or something in between hard authoritarianism and democracy. I don't even think you can have a non-democratic rule of law. And I think that's true in two senses. One is the theoretical and one is the empirical. In the theoretical sense, if you don't have genuine separation of powers, so you have independent courts that are not responsive to the ruling party, and that enforce the law and the Constitution in a reasonably neutral way. It's never perfect. Or at least over time, you have circulation of power and therefore ultimately some degree of either circulation of judges if they're appointed by the executive or circulation of the political context around the judiciary. This preserves the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law. If you have only one party that's ever going to rule, or you have no parties and no elections at all, and one ruler simply is hegemonic and dominates, not to mention the military, any kind of hegemonic ruler, clique, party, or institution like the military is not going to allow an independent rule of law enforced and interpreted by an independent, non-political judiciary. The law, as Vargas is reputed to have said, is too precious a weapon, potentially, or lever of power to allow it to be neutralized in this way and removed from executive control. So on a theoretical or philosophical plane, it's hard to imagine how you can have a genuine rule of law with constitutionalism, protection for rights, and independence of the judiciary in the absence of democracy. Now we can look at it in the empirical side, and there's a very easy and direct way to do this. I've done it. Take the Freedom House dimension of political rights, which has to do largely with the ability of people to, and groups of people, political parties and interest groups, to contest for power in free and fair elections, and to offer alternative platforms and policies and to lobby and contest over policy. That varies on a 7-point scale, from 1 being most free or most democratic to 7 be most authoritarian. Then take the civil liberties scale, which involves the rights that the rule of law is supposed to protect: freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and also includes a number of measures on judicial independence. And again, a scale where 1 is most free and 7 is least free. And ask, are there any countries in the world today that are above the midpoint on the political rights scale, or let's put it this way, that are above the midpoint on the civil liberties scale, that are at least moderately liberal, but are not democracies? And historically, there virtually never is any one. Singapore would be the closest you can get, and that Singapore has never risen above 4 on the political rights scale. Hungary, I think, may have a score of 3 on civil liberties now by the rating of Freedom House, but it's not a democracy. It's kind of slipped into illiberal autocracy. But it's very rare to never that you find a non-democracy that does a good job of protecting civil liberties. And moreover, it is not the case in either Hungary or Singapore, which would be the two most serious contemporary challengers to this theory, that you have a rule of law today in the true, genuine sense, for the following reasons. In Singapore, yes, there's a rule of law. If you have a commercial dispute, you will get a highly professional and I think probably very dispassionate ruling to protect your property rights and the fairness of contracts and so on and so forth. So if you're a business or commercial enterprise, there's a rule of law. But if you criticize the prime minister as a Singaporean and the prime minister sues you for damages, for libel in Singaporean court, the courts are going to be a slavish instrument of the ruling party and fine for the plaintiff and bankrupt you by leveling and this has happened in Singapore, leveling massive civil damages against you for having the temerity to criticize someone in power. That's not a rule of law. And moreover, the situation in Singapore is so distorted that if you were a Singaporean and said what I just said, you would be prosecuted for slandering the judiciary and again be punished with a jail term or sued into bankruptcy. And something similar in Hungary, where Viktor Orban has now stacked the Hungarian courts in a grotesque way. So you can't have a rule of law without a democracy. It just doesn't happen.
So can we say that the rule of law that you were speaking will be in capital letters, as the rule of law that exists in Singapore and Hungary, for instance, will not be in capital letters? That would be not the concept itself in its main definition, but as a secondary definition. There are laws which govern the people, but they do not apply for all people, so all people are not equal. The law would be more or less the situation.
Very well stated. I mean, you can call it whatever you want, semi-rule of law.
Semi-rule of law, almost rule of law.
Rule by law, because there can be arenas in Singapore of quite professional legal adjudication, but you don't find it in political life.
So, moving forward to another question. Right in the beginning of your book, In Search of Democracy, published in 2008, you said that the essential principles of democracy are popular sovereignty, accountability of rulers, freedom, and last but not least, the rule of law. And that commentary comes right afterwards. You state Hutchinson's point of view of the clash of civilizations. And what basically he states is that the rule of law is a Western civilization value and would not apply to other countries. Therefore, the rule of law, let's say, would not be a good concept to fit in countries that are not from the Western civilization, the Roman, Greek, and Christian tradition. How would you say that the rule of law, how would you defend that the rule of law is an universal value?
Well, I would do it again at two levels. One is philosophical, or a value, a normative plane, and the second would be on an empirical plane. On the philosophical plane, I would note that a large number of the vast majority of countries around the world at the time signed on to and embraced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, And very important rule of law concepts are built into those two master normative documents pertaining to individual rights in the world. Those universal documents were not presented as, and crucially, were not drafted as Western documents. In fact, a Chinese legal and constitutional scholar, obviously 1944, 45, this is before the communist revolution, so still from the period of nationalist rule with at least its democratic aspirations in China. A Chinese constitutional scholar played a very important role in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And multiple figures from non-Western society have played critical roles in trying to enforce the rule of law globally. As Secretary General, I think Kofi Annan is someone who should be singled out here. The great Ghanaian former Secretary General. People like Maina Kiai, who was the recent, from Kenya, the recent UN Special Rapporteur for freedom of assembly, and many others. So you've had many non-Western figures leading and embracing these documents. That's the philosophical level. And we find it, by the way, as well in public opinion polling, where you find that many peoples around the world may not perceive a great rule of law in their country, but indicate that that's what they want. They react against corruption, which is, of course, one of the principal and most outrageous contradictions of the rule of law, where individuals use state power for personal and group benefit rather than to fulfill their statutory and constitutional obligations as office holders. They react against violation of their rights, whether by government officials at the top or by police and ordinary bureaucrats at the local level. And we find this in many parts of the world, whether it's in Latin America and Africa. People are very insistent, even interestingly, in relatively poor countries in Africa with very low levels of average education. People are very insistent, as we have found through the surveys of the Afrobarometer, that they want judges to be independent of the judiciary. They want judges to be independent of the executive branch, not to take instructions from the executive branch. They want the president to be constrained by the Congress and the Constitution, to have to obey the courts. They want their rights protected. So I think normatively, it is impossible to say any longer, if it may have been true at one point, that the rule of law is a Western construct or a Western philosophical principle that is not shared by other cultures. Every culture, initially had authoritarian and lawless elements to it at one point, and they evolved. And the fact that there was some degree of philosophical and then institutional evolution earlier in some Western countries doesn't rule out the elements of rule of law, constraint of power, and constitutionalism that we're evolving and constraining power at the micro level elsewhere, at least to some degree, in some African cultures and in some Asian cultures and so on, and some indigenous communities in the Americas. Nor can it contradict the fact that today there are non-Western countries like Japan and Taiwan, and a few in Latin America. Chile's been pretty good in this regard, Uruguay, that are very strong in the protection of the rule of law. So if it ever was at one point in its manifestation or kind of philosophical crystallization, a Western concept more than a non-Western concept, I think that has evolved and changed over time.
Perfect. So shifting a little bit our topic from the rule of law to the state of exception, and taking into consideration as I said before, the COVID-19 pandemic. What will be the dangers of a state of exception nowadays, which we are, let's say, every single day media tells us that about the new normal, and it's kind of, I see personally as a form of normalizing the state of exception. And this book, especially written by George Orwell, 1984, brings a lot of reflections upon that. And what happens in the book, and I see what's happening now in some bigger or lesser degree, will be that the state of exception is constantly being invoked, so more power can be exercised over the people, more control can be exercised over people without a real situation for it. The situation nowadays of the pandemic is completely a disaster, a humanitarian and political disaster. Brazil, United States statistics speak for themselves. The number of deaths speak for themselves. But I see, for instance, in England, there was this measure passed by the government. I'm not sure if it was only in London or in the entire UK, that whenever you go to a bar, and you buy a beer, you need to tell the government that you went to that bar and bought that specific beer and sat at that specific table. And their justification is to track down the virus. In theory, it's a good measure. But when you think philosophically, as you said about it, it gives the government tools to track whatever steps the citizens may make, and to do this control, this biopolitical control of people. So in the 2020 scenario, taking into consideration this novel written by George Orwell, what are the dangers of the state of exception, and what are the limits of the states of exception, and how can we make sure that it is being evoked in a legitimate sense, not in the name of a phantom that the government's trying to combat?
Well, I think you've stated it quite perceptively, and of course Orwell is forever relevant, unfortunately, and shockingly prescient in some ways. 1984, now more than ever, with these tracking apps. Look, you have stated it. The greatest danger is loss of personal freedom and privacy. The second danger is that the loss won't be temporary but permanent, as the state's ability to track everything we do, everything we say, everywhere we go, everyone we interact with, becomes comprehensive, omniscient, and permanent. This, unfortunately, has become a kind of reality which many people don't adequately appreciate, in terms of private companies, private platforms. You think Facebook doesn't know, or Amazon, or Google, everywhere you go, everything you buy, everyone you talk to, everything you say? And if you are not, as a digital citizen, proactive in drawing boundaries around the data that you share with these big internet platforms, they'll suck it all up from your mobile phone and your computer, and know everything about you. And then they'll mash it into an algorithm that will predict your behavior, including, crucially for them, your buying behavior, but for political parties, your voting behavior, and what kind of appeals you will respond to with your vote and your loyalty and so on, better than you can predict it yourself. And they'll know what you're going to buy before you know what you're going to buy. And that's kind of the world we're entering into. Now, with respect to the companies, I think it's very clear that we need rules to contain the way they use and store and triangulate data, to fashion it into manipulative and controlling or hyper advertising algorithms. And we need much more vigorous regulation of the behavior of these internet platforms, including a requirement that users have to opt in to the data sharing comprehensiveness that the platforms are seeking, rather than opt out by kind of going to some particular settings profile in order to constrain what the companies can collect on them. And this is a burden on civil society and ultimately parliaments around the world to push for and draft the laws that will draw boundaries around what the platforms can collect in terms of your personal data, your buying data, your commenting data, your friend data, your social data, your health data, and utilize. Now we come to governments and the data that they may be able to collect with these COVID-19 health tracking apps. I am not an inflexible opponent of these tracking apps, because I think that they have helped, and we don't know how much. I think that we need more research to be done, but I think there's circumstantial evidence that in places like Taiwan and Korea, they have helped the governments track very rapidly and respond very proactively to initial instances of people having the virus, so that they could know exactly who a person was in interaction with, and they could send emails automatically to the contacts that a person was in interaction with to let them know you had a drink with someone who's now been tested COVID-19, quarantined for 2 weeks. So I think the problem is not with these apps. There's a new one now that's being required of people in India called Erosion Setu. It's what happens with them, and to what extent there's transparency, to what extent there's government enforced limits on how the data can be used, to what extent people's health data is sealed off from usage by the private companies or by the state for illicit purposes, to what extent the data is extinguished after a reasonable period of time, say maximum 90 days, but probably 30 days, so the data can't be held that long. And I will say that MIT, the technology lab at MIT, has been rating these COVID-19 tracking apps by 5 of these criteria of responsibility and giving a kind of 5-star to 1-star to no-star award. And the tracking apps that get high stars for algorithmic transparency, for limitation on the use of data, for time limits, and so on, those are the ones that I think meet the test of democratic states of exception.
So one thing I noticed will be that there's, let's say, a whole Bayesian state of mind here, that people are willing to give their liberty to a sovereign. In this case, would not be a monarch, but the state itself and its bureaucratic structure. And this whole Bayesian state of mind that's renouncing itself its liberty, and the state of exception will take advantage of this, and when not in the parameters of a stable rule of law or democratic system, and let's say install a police of thought, as I said, or a newspeak language as the new normal. It must be in Hungary that the president is there for indeterminate time. The same happened in Brazil in '64, that there was like a communist menace, and the army, they, for, let's say, in state of exception, for indeterminate time, they decided to say 25 years in power, what was supposed to be only 1 month, let's say.
Well,
so this
20, yeah.
So this police of thought, which people are speaking new languages, using new apps, and renouncing their liberty, would be, as I can say, a silent imposition of a state of exception under the rule of law, which people don't notice it's happening, but actually it's happening through their language, through what they think, through what they use in the internet, through what they renounce their liberty in the name of the government. And I extend my question to the following topic. What are the limits between security and liberty? And what's where does the rule of law is between security and liberty?
So here's what we know and could have anticipated, and in fact, many people did anticipate it, that illiberal and authoritarian leaders have used the crisis, and we could have predicted, I think probably many people in Brazil did predict this would happen in Brazil. And now we see it happening in India. It's been happening in the United States. And then in authoritarian regimes, Hungary, Russia, Venezuela, and so on, it's been happening, Uganda more mercilessly, that either authoritarian rulers or would-be autocrats, and I think Jair Bolsonaro is a would-be autocrat. He's made pretty clear he would prefer to govern as an authoritarian leader and thinks military rule was a pretty cool thing in the 1960s and 70s for Brazil. Maybe Brazil would be better off with it again, is the implication. They use these crises, whatever they are, to justify aggrandizement of their power and eclipse of the rule of law and civil liberties. This is the common thing we're seeing around the world. So you have Donald Trump unleashing the military on the streets of Washington, D.C. You have Narendra Modi in India arresting critics, and you have the authoritarian leader of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina, tightening the noose on the press and critics there. This is happening in much of Africa. Basically, it's just pure opportunism. We go back to Erich Fromm, Escape from Freedom, the communist menace of instability and left-wing terrorism. in the 1960s, the Al-Qaeda terrorist menace in the 1990s and early 2000s. When people are scared, whatever they might be scared of, they are more willing to surrender their freedom to a strong man or a strong woman, in the case of Sheikh Hasina or Indira Gandhi before her, or a strong force like the military, so that they can be secure. And almost always, this is a Faustian bargain. I mean, it's always a Faustian bargain. Almost always it's an illusion, because they don't really get security. They get a superficial veneer of security at the macro level, but at the price of personal insecurity. And nothing testifies more powerfully to the lack of personal security than the ability of the police to just come and arrest you for no constitutional reason, simply because you've issued a tweet or made a comment or written an article critical of the prime minister or the president or the military or the king of Thailand or whatever it might be. So fear is a powerful motivator. And I think it's incumbent upon us as Democrats, philosophically committed to liberalism and the rule of law, to puncture the myth that you can buy security by surrendering freedom, and to challenge the false tension that is posited between freedom and order, freedom and safety. You can still protect freedom, constitutionalism, and the rule of law, and have order and security within a democratic constitutional environment, and when necessary, as we have discussed earlier, impose carefully circumscribed and time-limited, transparent, and procedurally correct limitations on of a temporary nature on certain rights or freedoms.
So I identified, as you spoke, Mr. Diamond, something very clear in Plato's Republic, that there are those 5 forms of government, starting with the Republic itself, Plato's Republic, then democracy, then oligarchy, then democracy, and after democracy there comes tyranny. And I found interesting that the Socratic method is especially that to a government install itself in the polis, in the city, there must be already a state of soul of the people so that government can install. And exactly as you brilliantly said, the state of soul that leads democracy from tyranny is that the people depose their confidence and their security in one person. They love so much liberty that they have fear in losing the liberty, and they put exactly her liberty in the hands of a tyrant. At the beginning, it may seem not like a tyrant, may seem like a populist, but in the end, it comes like a tyrant. And as you said exactly in the beginning, you start with the sentence of Gandhi in The Spirit of Democracy, and is if Gandhi read Plato's Republic, and also gives its homonym of the title of your book, The Spirit of Democracy, which Gandhi says the spirit of democracy cannot be imposed from without, it has to come from within the soul of the people. The spirit of democracy is not a mechanical thing to be adjusted by abolition of forms. It requires change of heart. And it's like Plato is speaking the same thing as Gandhi, but 2,000 years before. And it's simply brilliant. So my last question before we proceed to the several comments we've received here would be, what are the measures that civil society must take to make sure that their spirit is not corrupted, it's not corroded by the state of exception installed by authoritarian regimes. So they can preserve inside themselves the spirit of democracy, the spirit of rule of law, and to be possible to identify a violation into the rule of law under the state of exception.
Well, when you study the deterioration of democracy under illiberal leaders who have what I call authoritarian projects or ambitions, you find there are two rings of defense against democracy, an inner ring and an outer ring. The inner ring is the other institutions of government outside of the authoritarian executive. And they would be the institutions of horizontal accountability, starting with the Congress and the judiciary, but inspectors general and independent electoral administrations and ombudsmen and monitoring and regulating agencies. And even if you have an independent civil service, that could be part of the inner ring, that they're not going to be politicized. They're going to preserve their independence. And even, we've seen this now in the United States, the military can play this role. And in Latin America in the last decade, 15 years, occasionally they have played this role where elected executives wanting to, really kind of crush protest and enlarge their power have tried to use the military, and sometimes the military has refused to be used that way as an instrument of repression of protest and dissent. It's really not their role. What happens is that when institutions are weak, or when you have very, very skillful leaders like Hugo Chavez, and especially when both conditions apply, the institutions have been weakened by a long period of decay, and you get an extremely wily Machiavellian and charismatic populist who knows how to manipulate the people and subvert the institutions. And Hugo Chavez was that, Putin was that, although Russia was always a very nascent and weak democracy. Erdogan has been that in Turkey. I think Morales in Bolivia had a lot of the features of that. When you get that, the institutions may not hold. The judiciary gets taken over and stacked with political loyalists. The other restraining institutions of horizontal accountability that Guillermo O'Donnell talked about get neutralized. And so you get to the outer ring of defense, which is civil society. And civil society has to mobilize and protest and speak up and advocate and lobby and try and stiffen the backs of the other regulatory institutions, the constraining institutions, the Congress, the courts, the regulatory institutions, before it's too late. And they have to do so across party lines, make clear that they're coming together to defend the Constitution and the rule of law, whatever their party might be. And this is the indispensable role of civil society. I can tell you, absolutely, always, they are the last line of defense against tyranny.
So, well, brilliant answer. It really makes me reflect about the role that civil society has, and it must not be silent. As the jargon says, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and the vigilance must come from the civil society. So let's move from some questions we received in the comments. Some quite interesting questions. I'm going to put them in the screen. From anomalous. Let me say that the state of exception is a maneuver, so people consciously give up their freedom to implement silent authoritarian regimes in the name of security. We already said a little bit about it, but it would be interesting to emphasize this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's another way of expressing what I was saying before, and it's very well expressed, that incipient autocrats use the language, the imagery of fear and danger to claim the need for a state of exception, which they do not intend to be exceptional or time limited, but which they want to see as a bridge to permanent exceptionalism, which is another way of saying authoritarianism.
Next question is for Francisco. He was my colleague at ISC. He was also at the event you held 3 years ago. And he asks, in the road to serfdom, Hayek points out the path from a temporary state of exception to a permanent state of authoritarianism. What can be done to prevent such a degrading of freedom?
Well, good. I think we need very clear laws and rules, first of all, for when and how a state of exception can be declared, who can declare it, and for how long and with what scope. So the Constitution needs to anticipate these things and draw clear boundaries against the use of the term. Look, we're entering a period of possibly other dangers. There are warnings coming. There have been warnings for a long time from my colleagues in medicine and biology that we could be facing a great pandemic. What we've got now is actually not the quote, the big one. It's not the nuclear version. We could face a much deadlier pandemic at some point in the future than COVID-19 will be, even at its worst. And we could, we're entering a period of more extreme weather because of climate change. So I don't think it's prudent or feasible to say there can never be a state of exception, a state of emergency, where the government can have certain exceptional powers. So we have to anticipate this and establish procedures by which a state of exception can be invoked and limits. So some of the things I would say are, if the state of exception is invoked, the Congress ought to be able, by the executive, the Congress ought to be able to override it if it doesn't find legitimate grounds for it. It should expire after 30 days, unless the Congress extends it or something like that. It should be limited to certain areas of rights or political functioning, and not be overly broad. Whatever decrees are enacted should automatically expire at the end of the state of exception, unless they are enacted by the Parliament or the Congress according to constitutional procedures. Things like this, you've got to kind of think it through by scenario and have it be grounded in the rule of law and due process.
Interesting you said about the Constitution stating limits. Actually, the Brazilian Constitution, which is a huge constitution, it has about 250 articles, but nevertheless, it states clearly there are two types of exceptions. One, I'm not sure how to translate it, but let's say it's a lighter state of exception and a harder state of exception. And each one of them have different measures, and they actually state days. For instance, the hard one can last only 30 days, and the president of the republic can do it for more 30 days, the maximum. So there are some limits. If actually the Brazilian Constitution that are interesting to pose to make a more check and balance accountability to maintain power and the institutions, the procedures, and the rule of law. Moving to another question, and this is a very interesting one. Good evening, Professor. Do you think that in the world in general, totalitarian countries have responded better to the COVID-19 pandemic because they have no problem with restraining civil freedom to practice social isolation after the pandemic? Is it possible for democracies to emerge fragile and go into decline because of the widespread fear caused by the virus? And the most clear situation would be China, absolutely. I mean, officially they say they had about 3,000 cases, but it is nevertheless impressive how quickly they could contain it. But that is to do because they are already a totalitarian and authoritarian regime. What would you say?
Well, what I would say is that anyone who says that China's been the most successful country at containing the virus is pointing to the wrong China. The country that has been statistically far and away of any significantly populated society in containing the virus with the lowest number of infections for 1,000 people or 1 million people and the lowest number of deaths is the Republic of China, Taiwan, which is the most democratic society or one of the two most democratic societies in Asia, and the exact inverse of the semi-totalitarian Communist Party state of the People's Republic of China. Moreover, we can point to other democracies, Australia, New Zealand, Israel to some extent, shockingly Greece, that have been exemplary in controlling the virus. And what did they do? They didn't sacrifice freedom in order to do this. They just governed well. They put their public health officials out in front in terms of setting policy and communicating what needed to be done. They immediately implemented a kind of travel restriction and close scrutiny of people coming into the country. They implemented very extensive testing, tracking, and tracing of people and anyone who showed symptoms of having COVID. Many of them used digital tracking devices, but not all of them. And they just had good, vigilant, scientifically based, intelligently communicated, vigorous, and centrally coordinated policies. And if you look at all those things, responsible policymaking, early action to respond to the pandemic and try and preempt it, deference to and elevation of medical and scientific authorities, early embrace of measures from face mask wearing to testing to tracking to tracing, heavy investment in the public health sector and in the necessary equipment. Those were not only all the things that Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, to some extent South Korea and Japan, Israel, Greece did. They are all the things that your country and my country did not do. And so it's got nothing to do with democracy. The democracies that did these things well have been exemplary in combating the illness, and the democracies that have had populist, authoritarian, science denier, illiberal, incompetent presidents have had the predictable result of the health catastrophes that we have in the United States and Brazil. Authoritarian regimes that learned from their mistakes and did these things on a mass basis have controlled the disease, China being one, Vietnam being another, and ones that didn't, like Iran, have the disease spinning out of control. Let me say also one more thing. We wouldn't have this problem. You wouldn't have the death rate you have in Brazil and the sprawling infection rate you have now. We wouldn't have it in the US. We wouldn't have lost 500,000 people around the world, and almost certainly more, probably twice that by now, unless the Chinese communist system had suppressed the initial evidence of this virus when it emerged in Wuhan, tried to keep it under wraps for fear of revealing something embarrassing that was going on, and enable this thing to spread and get on an airplane and come to the United States. I don't say, and I don't think that they intentionally wanted to infect the United States, but the lack of transparency is, and the fear of offending centralized authority is the reason that we have a global pandemic right now, and that's on the People's Republic of China.
Well, that last sentence you said is the exact same thing. The exact same thinking I have. You know, it is, if China was a liberal democracy, as for instance Taiwan or New Zealand, that made an incredible and extraordinary deal with the problem, incredible measures taken by New Zealand, especially, we wouldn't have this problem at all. No. So, last question before we finish, because our time is almost up. Another very interesting question. Mr. Diamond, is it possible that democracy, it's evolving, becomes its very opposite? What I mean is, in order to ensure rights, the state takes on more and more duties, getting bigger and more authoritarian each time it tries to ensure rights. Therefore, if that's correct, did the COVID crisis accelerate this process of democracy becoming a tyranny, its desire to ensure itself?
Well, this is a very philosophically and empirically challenging and important question. I think it evokes important debates on multiple levels, and not only the one that the questioner articulated. So, in terms of what you, the questioner, have raised, there's the issue of the Brazilian Constitution and all the rights in that, let's face it, are really not what they call justiciable. How do you really enforce a right to health and education and so on? There's so much that's involved with state capacity. I think embedding positive rights in the Constitution can risk diminishing the original political rights, and saying that nothing can really be guaranteed to be delivered by the state. So I think we need to be careful in what the state promises, but we need to be pushing the state to be effective and governable and professional, and to always be understanding that an effective liberal democracy, a sustainable liberal democracy, which is another way of saying a good democracy, a democracy worth having, rests on multiple legs. It's got the leg of democracy and electoral integrity and competition. It's got the leg of rights and protection for civil and political rights. And it has to have the leg of an effective state that's capable of delivering what people expect of government in terms of social and economic, I'm going to call them goods rather than rights, though I think people should have a right to healthcare and education. It's just obviously got to be proportional to the wealth and capacity of the state and society. I think that COVID-19 has challenged democracy, not because it's pushing for more rights, but because it's crowding in against rights with the state of exceptionalism and the potential for monitoring and control that has emerged in the effort to control the virus, or just the imagery of fear and danger that we've talked about that autocrats are manipulating. But I want to close by saying this: the classic fear of tyranny that really goes back to both Aristotle and Plato, certainly to the Greeks, and was extremely important in the thinking of the American constitutional framers in the Federalist Papers, Madison, Hamilton, and so on, was a particular kind of tyranny, the tyranny of the mob, the tyranny of the majority. And this is why they felt the rule of law was so important, to break the power potentially of the majority that would trample the rights of the minority. And what they feared was, frankly, to put it boldly, Donald Trump or Jair Bolsonaro or some other illiberal populist who would appeal to people's fears, get himself elected, in the case of the United States, not even by a majority of the popular vote, and then begin to trample freedom and constitutionalism. And if I may, I'd like to present another book that I've recently published called Ill Winds: Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. And I open this book by quoting from one of the constitutional framers, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton, who wrote this in 1787: "Of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying in obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and ending tyrants."
Well, fantastic. I am a personal fan of the Federalist Papers. I read some of them. And well, the correct thing would be protect democracy, or better, protect the republic, because the Federalists, they weren't democratic in the exact sense of the word. They were Republicans. Protect the republic from the factions, the big factions. And well, the Federalist Papers are, let's say, a fantastic chink of fantastic work of political science, of philosophical politics, and until nowadays, as you said, it has very important and actual implications in the nowadays world. So, Mr. Diamond, we have already exceeded 9 minutes from what I promised you, but in the name of the Paideia Study Group, Philosophy of Law here in the Federal University of Paraná, I would like to thank you very, very, very much for your presence here. You know the entire admiration I have with you, how the spirit of democracy and the In Search of Democracy have inspired me to choose the law school and also to model the way I think. And I would like to thank the name of the group, and in my name, my personal name, I'm very glad to be here, and it's more than a pleasure, Mr. Diamond. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good luck to you all. Thank you for having me.